Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. So for those who are just joining in for the first time this week, we couldn't be more excited to be hosting events during Secret Path Week in partnership with the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund. So the Downie Wenjack Fund is part of musician Gord Downie's legacy and embodies his commitment and that of both Downie and Wenjack families to call Canadians to action in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of this land. So the goal is to continue the conversation that began with Chanie Wenjack's residential school story and to support the reconciliation process through awareness, education, and action. So for the next 4 school days, we'll be joined by classrooms all across Canada to help us celebrate Indigenous scientists, artists, and leaders from across the country and work towards meaningful reconciliation. So we're really lucky today to be joined by Andrea Reid. She's an Indigenous fisheries scientist, conservation biologist, and National Geographic explorer based in Canada. So in January 2021, she'll be joining the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries as an assistant professor of Indigenous fishery science. She belongs to the Nisga'a Nation of British Columbia's North Coast and has significant experience with Indigenous fisheries communities, practices, perspectives, and issues in British Columbia, as well as around the world. So places like East Africa, Oceania, and Southeast Asia. So Andrea, it's so great to have you joining us live today. We've got a great group of classrooms joining us both live on camera and in YouTube, classrooms all across Canada. And we're really excited to get to know you a little better.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Joe. Can everybody hear me okay? I can't hear you, so you have to wave your arms if you can hear me. Okay, sounds like everyone can hear me. Great. So before I do anything, I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm on right now. So I'm joining you from Carleton campus in Ottawa. This is the territory, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe peoples. It's really important to recognize whose land we're on to think about who the original stewards of these lands and waters are. Has everyone here heard a land acknowledgement before? Can I get a thumbs up if you've heard one? Yeah, so lots of school groups start that way. We hear them at the start of assemblies, and it's a small thing that we can do to start thinking about the space that we're in and who was here before European settlers. Awesome. So now that I've done that, I also wanted to mention that it's really cool how Indigenous place names can tell us a lot about a place. So as I said, I'm in Ottawa, Ontario. So Ottawa is actually an Algonquin word that means the trading place, because this is a place where a bunch of different rivers meet and lots of Indigenous peoples would meet here to trade fish for other kinds of foods, for berries, for lots of different things. And Ontario is also an Indigenous word that comes from the Huron-Wendat, and it refers to the beautiful lake, meaning the Great Lakes that are in Ontario. So really neat to think about where we get the names for places from and the ties that that has to the peoples who are the original stewards of these places. So now that you know a little bit about me, I'm going to shift over to my presentation here. Can everybody see this? Can I get arms waving if you can see it? Okay, so this is my beautiful home province. This is where I grew up. This is Prince Edward Island, also known as Abegwit. Here we go. So this is on the east coast of Canada, and Abegwit is the Mi'kmaq word for the land that's cradled on the waves. So I grew up here on the ocean in Mi'kmaq territory. This is me when I was little on my absolutely favorite beach, just 10 minutes from my house, and I used to collect shells and rocks and watch for fish and swim as much as I could, and that's really where my love of water and fish really came from. So when I grew up and went to university, I was so surprised to learn that I could make fish and water the very center of what I do for a living. And so at university, I then became a National Geographic explorer, getting grants from National Geographic to study really cool fish in very unlikely places, like Joe said in the introduction, working in East Africa, the South Pacific, and in many different countries in search of really tiny fish in some cases, and in other cases, fish that are bigger than me. And trying to find them in really unique places, working with fishers to better understand the fish. So I get to dive and snorkel and search for these cool fish for a job. So I feel pretty lucky that I get to do that. A part of my story that I haven't told you yet is that I'm a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation, as Joe introduced properly. So up here, you can see that red arrow in the top left of the screen, pointing to that yellow area. That is Nisga'a territory. And so that's just at the bottom of the Alaska Panhandle, at the very north coast of BC, just in the top left corner of British Columbia. This is the place that my Gigi, my grandmother, she comes from there. And that's also where my father's from. But due to the residential school system and because of the 1960s scoop, my father didn't get to grow up in our community. He didn't get to grow up facing these beautiful mountains and ocean and this wonderful part of land. And he didn't get to grow up in our community or with the Nisga'a language. And because of that, neither did I. So for both myself, my brothers, my father, we all had to find our way home in adulthood. So a really neat part of my story is that one of the ways that I found my way back to this community to reconnect with my culture and be part of this nation was actually through fish. Can people see what fish I'm holding here? Can you guys see this guy? Do you guys know what it is? Can you if you have a guess, raise your hand. What kind of fish is this? Yeah, that's right. Oh, it's so good to hear your voices. So there's 5 kinds of Pacific salmon, and sockeye is one. And look, I even have a sockeye salmon up here on the wall. And I love salmon. I think that they're so neat, and they have these really big migrations, and they move across massive amounts of land. They start out when they're just little in lakes and streams, and then they work their way down rivers into our giant ocean so they can eat as much as they can and get as big as they possibly can before they go back to fresh water. They go back to their home rivers, so they can go all the way back to where they were born and spawn, have their babies right where they were born. So a lot of you have probably learned about the salmon life cycle in school, but it's a really neat thing that connects communities way inside British Columbia that are far from the ocean with the very distant ocean, almost halfway to Russia in some cases. So it's really cool to see how those fish can transport nutrients and energy across space and time. So unfortunately though, because salmon are not doing so well right now, there's so many threats that they encounter along their life cycle. So as they move from streams to the ocean and back again, they're passing dams, they pass lots of pollution, they get intercepted by fisheries. There's all kinds of things that can get in their way from migrating properly. So their numbers are starting to decline, and it's a big cause for concern. And this is exactly what my PhD centers on. So I'm now doing all of my schooling centering on the lovely sockeye salmon, and I'm studying their migrations in 2 really cool ways. The first thing I do is I use radio tags and transmitters. So if you can see this tag here, I take these tags and they emit a radio signal, and every 3 seconds you can hear these tags make a little chirping sound. And so what I do is I take the tag, and while the fish are just about to go back in the river, I capture the fish in the ocean just before they enter fresh water and bring them inside a boat. And when they're inside the boat, I keep them submerged in water the whole time. And for each one, we'll keep them in the water and we'll put the tag down their throat and put it into their bellies. And because they went to the oceans to eat as much as they possibly can and get as big as they possibly can, they actually completely stop feeding when they're about to hit the rivers. And so when they hit the rivers, they're no longer using their bellies. So instead of having to perform a surgery on the fish, or instead of having to just keep the tag on the outside of the fish, we can just put it right in their belly and it doesn't have any impact on the fish. So it's a really cool way of finding out where they go. So I put those tags inside the fish, and then, like you can see in this picture, I use radio antennas to listen for the fish so I can pick up that signal and see where the fish go, how fast they get there, and I can look at all kinds of things about which ones actually made it all the way back to where they grew up, all the way back to their spawning grounds, and which ones didn't, and how those things might be affected by things like pollution and dams and fisheries, the threats that I mentioned a few minutes ago. The other thing that I do is I talk to people. So not just anybody, but I spend a lot of time interviewing Indigenous elders about their knowledge of Pacific salmon and their knowledge of their migrations and the threat to their migrations. They know more than anyone you can imagine. They know so much because it's not just the knowledge they've accrued in their single lifetime, it's knowledge from across generations. So they know things about the salmon dating back from their Gigi's time, from their grandmother's time, and their great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's time, and that sort of thing. So I'm learning really cool things about how many fish actually reach their spawning grounds and what's allowing them to do that or getting in their way. And then I'm also trying to learn from Indigenous knowledge keepers, things that we can do to better treat the fish, to make sure that more fish are making it to spawning grounds so that we have enough fish to support us moving into the future. So those are the two main parts of my research right now. And it's really important that we do these kinds of things, that we think about ways to protect our beautiful oceans and lakes and rivers, because these are places that if we don't try to curb how we're treating them, the future is going to look really different for these places. This is a picture again of the Nass River. This is the home of the Nisga'a Nation. And the name Nass actually comes from a Tlingit word. That's a neighboring nation to the Nisga'a. And Nass means guts or intestines because of the food capacity in its fish. So pictured here is another nice salmon. And this is one that we're tagging in the river to see where it goes and see how it does. And so without these fish, communities that rely on the fish for generations are going to shift. And so that's a big part of what I focus on as well. And that's something that really drew me into working on fish in the first place, is the human component of getting to talk to fishers and learn from what they know, and getting to talk to community members and kind of bringing everyone together around things that we all care about, which is the conservation of fish and fisheries. And our oceans and our lakes and rivers, they all need protection in order to protect the fish and fisheries and all the practices and knowledge systems that rely on them. So another big part of what I do focuses on outreach and training the next generation of water and fish protectors. So one thing that I do is I've started a not-for-profit that's called Riparian. And what we do, the word riparian means of the riverbank. And what we do is we take groups of youth on multi-day river expeditions, and we teach them the basics of freshwater science so that they can learn how to study lakes and rivers, how to be safe on them, so that they can go out and enjoy them and become that next generation. So that's one big thing. And then the next is I also lead science camps in my nation, where I'm trying to get the youth excited about the Nass River, about sockeye, about all the salmon, and try to bring them together to help protect the Nass River and all of its importance. But instead of telling you more about what I do in the camps, I wanted to show you. So I'm going to try to show you this video, and hopefully this works for everyone. Let's see. Can you guys wave your arms if it works? Is it working? Yeah? Perfect.
So it's important for each one of you to know who you are. That means you belong to the person you love.
Oh, there we go. So I just wanted to share that with you so you could get a sense of what we do during those camps, what the youth get to learn and get to see. And then the last thing that I wanted to say about training the next generation of fish and water protectors is what Joe alluded to right off the bat, and that's that I'm joining UBC as an assistant professor in 2021. This is the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, pictured here, and I'm going to be the Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit chair once I join there. And I'm really going to spend a lot of time focusing on getting Indigenous scientists and knowledge keepers inside the university campus. We need different ways of looking at problems in our waters and with our fish. And so hopefully by bringing together multiple perspectives and multiple ways of learning and knowing the fish and the waters, we can do a better job of it all together. So that's really my mission moving forward. And so with that, I want to turn it over to you guys. Definitely follow me on social media. You can ask me questions there, but I'm with you for the next 25 minutes or so. I'm not sure how much time we have left, Joe, but I would be happy to answer any questions or hear your comments or ideas for what we can do for our fish and fisheries.
All right. Awesome, Andrew. And you're right on the money. We've got about 25 minutes. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. And those camps look like a ton of fun. So thanks for sharing that little video with us.
My pleasure. They are. They're super fun to lead. So I've been getting to do one every single year. I keep going back.
All right, perfect. Well, Andrea, I'll just ask you to hit the stop screen share so we can see you front and center again, and we'll start meeting some of our classrooms. So I can see we've got a good group joining live on YouTube. So don't forget there's a chat sidebar on the right. Let us know where you're watching from and send us in some questions there. And I want to give a shout out to Birchmount Park Collegiate Institute in Toronto who are tuning in. So let's get more of the groups introducing themselves in the chat bar. So let's go to a live classroom. Let's start off with Mrs. Kramer's grade 7 students in Invermere, British Columbia. Let's turn their microphone on. There it is. How are we doing, grade 7s? All right, who's up with a question?
Are you okay?
You guys have a question? We're ready for you. Okay, maybe we'll come back to Mrs. Kramer's group.
You muted yourself.
Joe, I lost your audio.
How about now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. So we're going to Mrs. Spears' class joining us in British Columbia. Let me turn their microphone on. In fact, Mrs. Spear, I'll have to get you to do it. You've got a tricky microphone in your classroom, but there's some grade 5, 6 students hanging out there with us. All right, I see them nice and front and center. If you just want to click the mute button in the bottom left, Mrs. Spear, and then the student can go ahead with their question. All right. Andrew, we're not having much luck getting the Q&A started. Let's try another classroom. Let's go to Mrs. Hoffman's group. Grade 6 is joining us. Let me turn their microphone on. How are we doing, grade 6s?
Good.
All right, that's a promising start. Who's got a question for us?
Hi. Do you research other fish than only salmon? And what way do you want to help them?
That's a great question. So I do research other fish as well. I research bumphead parrotfish in the Solomon Islands. Here, I'm gonna pull up a picture for you. I didn't have one in my presentation, but I will share my screen in 1 second so you can see what kind of fish this is. Can you guys see this? Yeah, so these are bumphead parrotfish. This is a really important fish in the Solomon Islands, and this is one that I studied through a National Geographic grant as well. And they're such cool fish. Like a single one of these is way bigger than me. And let me show you one in comparison to a diver. Look at this guy. These are fish that they can be hundreds of kilograms, they can be gigantic. And what's really cool is that they eat coral reefs. And when they poo out the coral, they poo it out like a fine grained sand. So they're actually the way that a lot of our white sand beaches get formed. They're really important fish, but unfortunately, they taste a lot like lobster. And so people like to eat them a lot, and they're really big. And so in a lot of their range, they're not doing very well. So I work with local fishers in the Solomon Islands to try to better manage these fish and try to find areas that we can set aside to keep these fish safe.
All right, very cool, Andrea. I love sharing that fact with students that when they're on those nice white sandy beaches in those nice warm tropical places, that odds are that sand passed through the digestive tract of a parrotfish. So very cool. So I see we lost Mrs. Spears' group for a moment, but looks like they made it back in British Columbia. How are we doing, boys and girls?
Good.
All right, perfect. I see someone front and center in a Blue Jay shirt. Do you have a question for us?
Do you have to monitor the people who are when so many people are buying fish for their aquarium? Do you have to help monitor that to make sure that not all fish are gone forever?
That's also a really good question. So another project that I work on with National Geographic is called Reef to Aquarium. And I can bring up the website for that and show you guys that. 1 second.
Well, Andrew, it appears that the classrooms have done their research on you.
Yeah, apparently they're asking great questions. Okay, let's see if you can see this now. Everyone can see? Okay, great. So this is the project that I participated in called Reef to Aquarium, where we were tracking the journey of fish from reefs in Indonesia and the Philippines, which are the places that most aquarium fish are coming from, all the way to the United States, which is the biggest importer of aquarium fish. So you can see this map here. This is the journey these fish take. And do you guys recognize this kind of fish? Do you know what fish this is? And you raise your hand and recognize it. That's right. And you know what local fishers call this fish? They call it letter 6. They call it letter 6 because you see the black on the side of the fish. It makes that shape of a 6. So that's what they call it. And this is a fish that, because of the movies, has been in high demand. And it's not a fish that we're able to breed in captivity. So all the dories that we see in tanks, they're typically coming from the wild. They're typically coming from Indonesia and the Philippines. And we worked on this project to go to reefs and see how the fish are collected, see all the crazy things that the fishers do to try to collect the fish, what they do for a living, collecting individual fish one at a time, free diving underwater. And then we tracked how those fish get shipped through middlemen and transporters, all of these people who export the fish from one place to another, boxing it and bagging it and taking it around the world, all so we can get to the United States to be in the tank of a hobbyist. I don't work on monitoring how many fish move around the world, but there's a really important program at the New England Aquarium that's led by Dr. Andy Ryan, and he's done a lot to monitor how many fish are moving where. And then there's certain things that we have in place, like CITES, which is an agreement that we have on the trade of endangered species and exotic species, and that helps to regulate which fish are moving around the world. It's a really good question.
All right. Well, Andrea, I was just checking the YouTube feed, and we've got a really good question there that I want to ask. So someone is wondering, how big can the salmon get, and have Indigenous elders noticed a change in their size in recent years?
Oh, that's a really good question. So before I mentioned that there are 5 species of salmon, can I hear you guys unmuted? Can you guys name them for me? So we got 1, we got sockeye. What are the 4 others?
Why are their faces so weird?
Earlier, I did hear somebody say chum, so that's another kind. We have Chinook. They're also known as the spring. We have coho. And can anybody remember the one that I'm missing?
Amelia. Smart answers. Nobody knows or salmon.
Rainbow. Rainbow.
Of the salmon, but it's not one of the 5 main species. But so each of those kinds of salmon are a little bit different in size. Some get really, really big, like the Chinook. They can get really large. Sockeye are more mid-range, but it depends on which one you're talking about. But they have noticed a change in the size. If you look at historic photos of salmon, some of them used to be, it could be upwards of 100 pounds. They used to be gigantic in many cases. And what's happening in the salmon fishery, as with fisheries around the world, is we're fishing them down. So we're getting smaller and smaller individuals. Salmon can still be pretty big. Salmon are regularly the size of that fish, which is a pretty big fish, but not like they used to be. So elders have noted changes in the size for sure. That's a great question.
All right, keep those questions coming on YouTube. Let's go visit another live classroom. So we're going to go to, let's see, there we go. This is Archibald's class, hanging out with us in Toronto, Ontario. Let's get that microphone turned on. There it is. How we doing, Toronto?
Good.
Do you guys have a question for me?
Yeah. How, when you put the chip in their stomach, how do you get them to like swallow it?
That's a really good question. So here's my fish. Here's the radio tag right here. And when it's turned on, it makes this little chirping sound. It sounds kind of like a cricket, and it makes that sound every 3 seconds. And what I do is I don't have one with me right now, but I put it on a long, it's like a straw. It's like a big straw. And then I take the tag on the big straw, put it down the fish's throat, and then I pull the straw out. The antenna, it has to stay outside the fish's mouth to help transmit that signal, but the antenna just hugs alongside of the fish. On a real fish, it's not quite so long. You'd only have a little bit hanging out, and it just stays alongside the fish like that as it swims.
All right, great question. Let's see, let's go back to Mrs. Kramer's group in Invermere, British Columbia. Let's get their microphone on. There it is. All right, how we doing, boys and girls? All right, we got someone nice in front and center.
Where's the coolest place you went with National Geographic?
Where's the coolest place that I went? I've been to a lot of really cool places. That's a good question. So it's hard to rank them. Lots are cool for lots of different reasons, but I'll give you a few of my favorites. One is what I've previously mentioned, the Solomon Islands. So those are just east of Papua New Guinea. And there are hundreds of islands that many of them don't have people on them. A lot of them are just really little, and they're just surrounded by beautiful reefs. Solomon Islanders are super, super friendly, and we were there for months. So it was really nice to work with them, get to eat their food. They eat a ton of coconut and fish and all kinds of fresh vegetables and that kind of thing. So we were there for months working with these fishers, and when we were there, we got to snorkel and dive in all these cool places. There was even this island called Skull Island that was a tiny island that nobody lives on, but it was covered in all of the skulls of all the important chiefs of the past. It was an important shrine for the people there. So it was a really interesting place to see, and somewhere I never expected to find myself. But I've been to lots of really exciting places that are just things that I'd never picture. And that's one of the great parts about working with National Geographic, is it just opens lots of doors like that.
All right. Let's see. We need to go visit Mrs. Thiessen's group. They are hanging out with us in British Columbia at Green Timbers Elementary. Looks like some 3rd and 4th graders. Let's get that microphone on. How we doing, 3rd and 4th graders? A big group of 3rd and 4th graders.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long have you been studying for?
How long have I been studying for? That's a good question. Most of my life, I've always been studying. So I went to university right after I finished high school, and I did my bachelor's degree, which took 4 years. And then I did my master's degree, which took 2 years. But then I took 2 years off to go travel, and I did some work with National Geographic, and I wanted to make sure that whatever I did right now for my PhD was exactly what I wanted to be doing. So I needed time to think. And then now I am in my last year of my PhD, year 5. So that's a lot of years of school when I add them all together. And then when I finish this PhD, I'll be going to UBC to teach. So I'll be in school my whole life.
All right. Well, it is a lot of school, but you're studying something you're passionate about. So I bet it doesn't always feel like schoolwork.
Yeah, no, it's getting to work on the water and on fish is not like a normal job. So if I get, paid to be on boats, snorkeling, scuba diving, that's the kind of job I want.
All right. Let's see, Mrs. Harrison's class. They are joining us. I believe they're in British Columbia as well. Looks like a mixture of students at Lake Trail Community School. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, boys and girls? All right, who's got a question?
Go ahead, Riley. What's your favorite fish?
What's my favorite fish? Yeah. Well, sockeye currently is really my favorite fish because I think that they're so cool. They do so many cool things. Like when they come back from their migrations, they spawn in almost the exact same place where they were born. So they have a crazy geospatial memory that even scientists don't understand really well. Another fish that I love is a fish that I worked on in East Africa, in Uganda, in the Lake Victoria Basin, and it's called Pseudochronolabris multicolor. I'm gonna pull up a picture to show you. It's a really cool fish that's oh, 1 second, sorry, trying to find that photo. It's a really cool fish that's a mouth brooder. So it has these big bright lips. Its English name is blue lips. And inside, the females will keep all the little babies inside her mouth. So here, I'll show you what that looks like. So these are blue lips. P multicolor, Pseudochronolabris multicolor. And they're really pretty fish. And a really cool thing about them is that they're what we call plastic fish. They change a lot in response to their environment. And so they can inhabit environments that become really hard for them. So as the climate changes or as lakes become less and less oxygenated, when there's less oxygen available in the water, it's really hard for fish to survive, for them to breathe underwater. but these fish are really good at adapting. And so if you can find them in little wetlands and in little creeks and streams where there's not a lot of oxygen available in the water and few other things can live, but these guys manage to.
All right, very cool. Thanks for sharing. So Andrew, I think we can probably squeeze in a couple more questions with our classrooms. So boys and girls, give me a wave if you guys have a question that you want to ask Andrea, if you've got one that's a burning question. Let's see. Mrs. Kramer's class, I see lots of waving, so I'm going to turn your microphone on.
My question was if you ever went to like somewhere like the Galapagos Islands or something like that.
I haven't been to the Galapagos, but I've been to, yeah, lots of different places. I've been to, it's hard to list them all, but to Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, the Philippines, I've been to various parts of the United States and Canada, various places in South America. I've been to Peru and Bolivia. On the African continent, I've been across West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, so many countries there, and I really love my time there. And then a bit in Europe and a bit on the other side of Asia as well. So a little bit all over. I've gotten to travel to 6 continents, everywhere but Antarctica, to study fish. So it's been a really nice way to travel.
All right, and I think that's a really good point to bring up, is that a career in science, a career in conservation can take you so many amazing places around the world. There's lots of awesome opportunities if you continue studying science and you get really passionate about something.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, where's my next waving? Where should we go next? All right, Mrs. Archibald's group, your microphone is on.
How cold is the water normally when you're looking for fish?
Oh, it depends on where I am in the world, but it can vary. That's a really good question. In the Solomon Islands that I was mentioning, sometimes the water would be like 28 degrees Celsius. So it would be like a bathtub. We couldn't wear a wetsuit. We were always so hot. You jump in the water for 1 second, it would be refreshing. And then 2 minutes later, you're like, I'm sweating. I need to get out of here. But then I've worked in cold waters too, but mostly just in British Columbia. So the water wouldn't be, generally when I'm working, the water's not colder than like 10 degrees kind of thing. So chilly, you'd want a wetsuit for that.
All right, where should we go next?
I think Vernon Christian, there's a lot of waving there.
A lot of waving there. I'll just need to get them to turn the microphone on because, oh no, it worked this time. Perfect.
Okay.
We're ready.
How do you take the tags out of the fish's mouth or out of their stomach?
That's a really good question. So one thing that I didn't say about how cool sockeye are is that when they complete their migrations, when they are done going to the ocean, they come all the way back up to the rivers, they're back where they were born, that completes their life cycle, and they lay their eggs and fertilize their eggs, and they die in that place. So they're what's called semiparous. It means that they have one reproductive event in their lifetime. And so the fish are gonna die there, and then I can go on those spawning grounds and I can collect the tags again from the fish. I'll just take them back out of the fish's mouth and we can use them again in a future year. The batteries in these things last 2 to 3 years, so we can use them again in the next study. So that's generally what we do. We can't always find the fish though. It can be tricky because sometimes eagles and bears are in there. They move our fish around, so we don't get every tag back.
All right, well, Andrea, I think a good spot to leave off was this question from online. It's from 2 different groups actually, and they're wondering about the most challenging and the most satisfying parts of your work.
That's a really good question. The most challenging part of my work, it's a tricky one though. I think the challenging part is that I get to do so many fun things for a big portion of the year. So my summers and often my falls are spent out on the water doing all those things I showed you. But then that means that in the winter times, I have to come back to my office and spend a lot of time on the computer. And there I'm spending a lot of time looking at a lot of numbers. So that can be a big challenge, is making sense of all of the data that I collect from all these fish so that I can summarize it in ways that help us form policy and make decisions about those fish. So it can be, that's where it's really challenging, is navigating. For my salmon studies, I'll have millions of data points. So it's really big data and it's a lot to handle. The most satisfying part is what I showed you at the end, and that's working with guys like you, the next generation. It's been amazing to lead camps and expeditions and just to see how bright and interested the next generation is in a lot of these questions. There's so much enthusiasm, and that gives me a lot of hope for our fish and fisheries.
All right, I like those answers. Well, Andrea, first of all, a huge thank you to you. Thank you so much for taking some time to hang out with us and share the important work that you do. And I have no doubt that there's some students who are excited about the prospect of getting out on the water and seeing what they can find. So thank you so much for spending some of Secret Path Week with us.
Awesome, my pleasure. Thank you guys for joining. It was great to see you all and hear all your good questions.
All right, and just a quick reminder that we do have one more event today at 2:30 p.m. Eastern with Angela Miracle Gladue, and that should be a really fun event. So you can tune into YouTube for that one. Lots more events tomorrow and Monday, Tuesday next week. And the last thing we'll do today is I'm going to turn on all the microphones, boys and girls. Let's get loud. Let's get a big goodbye and thank you to Andrea today. So here we go. Let's go. All right, you guys are always so good at that. Andrea, once again, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see your classrooms later this week.
Bye, guys. I'm sure all of my office neighbors heard you guys saying thanks, so take care.